If you want to sell to bigger companies with 50 or more employees, then this video is the right for you. I'm going to interview an experienced founder who has been selling to enterprise clients for many years, and we will learn important lessons on how to sell to such clients effectively. Before we jump to the interview, I will summarize the most important lessons that I learned from that interview. It can be a little bit uncomfortable to start with sales, with cold outreach. But if you are passionate about your startup, if you feel that you are helping your clients, that your product is really great, it changes the dynamic. So it's not you're asking the client for something, but it's a equal cooperation. You can help them and they can pay you for that. And it's important to understand, especially in the beginning, that it's not about pitching. It's about listening and learning from your target audience. An important factor selling to enterprises is that it takes very long. Usually you need several calls. So the first call is a discovery call. And the discovery call can take just 15 minutes just to understand if it's a right match. And Matt never answered before the whole 15 minutes because even if it's not the right match, maybe he can learn something from the person, or maybe the person can recommend someone else. It's all about building relationships with the right people and building trust. You have to be honest about things your software cannot do, and that builds trust. Be honest about your limitations, about your knowledge, and don't get discouraged by critiques. Matt had a client who hated his product, but after talking with that client for some time, this client became a big fan of the product. So sometimes there are some miscommunications, there are some misunderstandings, and don't react emotionally to that. It's just part of the way. It's not about evaluating you, it's about a match. You cannot force anyone to like your product or yourself, and just try to make the best out of it. And be aware of cultural differences. US companies, people from US react totally different than people from Europe or Asia. Try to be sensitive to that as well. And now we move to the interview with Matt. I think many SaaS entrepreneurs, they lack in sales, and today you can help them.
Yeah, nice. Maybe if it might be best to start kind of the beginning where I learn a lot of my tricks of the trade. So when I left university, I went and joined a company who was selling into a variety of big enterprise businesses, executives, so recruitment. And it was about 2011, for those of you that are old enough. We were post credit crisis, but it was still in the recession. So it was not a great time to be selling into financial services. I remember, like, in the first couple of weeks, all my manager at the time wanted me to do is just pick up the phone and reach out to people. And I know that's like one of those skills that people find really uncomfortable. This was at the time when LinkedIn wasn't particularly popular. I remember very distinctly logging into LinkedIn, getting kind of going, and my manager being a little bit perplexed that I was using it as much as I was. Essentially, there was no LinkedIn Sales Navigator. It was just basic stuff. Yeah, essentially what we were told to do, just build a market. Me and my manager, I was reaching out to senior executives at banks across the world, trying to generate interest, trying to identify leads, really with nothing. So it's just a great piece of like work that we did, but like we had no product. People wanted to leave companies, but like didn't necessarily want to leave because it was a very tough market. We'd often have to kind of white label CVs and try and get people to buy. About 3 months in, we actually, we weren't making any headway whatsoever. We weren't selling. All the markets had basically closed up at that point. And so we then transitioned completely away from financial services to pharmaceuticals. Now, we were selling into the Benelux countries, Switzerland, Germany, and that was wild because neither of us had any background in pharma. And these are people that are, earning $500,000 $1 million a year, running the supply chains of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And we had absolutely no right to be playing there. It was super tough. But I think I look back at that time in my career and I go yes, it was super hard and I didn't love it. And I probably wasn't that successful at generating income, but I managed to speak to so many different people. And I think like that, like natural curiosity kind of got me through when you're on the phone for hours and hours at a time.
What a journey, or what a start of a journey.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think sometimes you get managers that come into your life that you hate, but then 10 years later you go, oh, maybe that was a great experience. And I think that's exactly what happened.
Wow. Which challenges did you face in this phase, and what did you learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like when we were calling people up, I remember one conversation very distinctly. It was a Swiss company in Geneva, and I called up this dude, and he was a very senior guy, global responsibilities. And I spoke to him on the phone for 2 hours. And I mean, that's a long phone call for anybody. And you always have to assume, and this is a great piece of advice that I've always been told, people love talking about themselves. So, like, the average discovery call should be 90% of them talking and 10% of you talking, like, irrespective of whatever situation you're in. And this guy literally I just asked a question and he just ran with it. To begin with, like, I would use scripts, questions that I would ask. You quickly kind of learn the questions to ask. And I remember getting to the end of that phone call and it being like genuinely really interesting and like me learning an awful lot about the business, the way he operated. He came to the end of the call and he said, "So what's the role that you're talking to me about?" I had no role. I had nothing. And I was like, "Oh, there's this role, but I don't think you're right for it. You're too senior." And he was like, "Oh, I know the role you're talking about. Yeah, I actually know about that role." And I just remember thinking, "What? You don't, I have nothing." And at that point, I was almost tempted to ask him, "What role are you talking about?" Because then I want to go and sell someone else that I'm working with into that same company. But I think what it teaches you is that people will always be willing to talk about themselves. And the hardest barrier is picking up the phone. And I think like that's probably the biggest learning like the last 15 years is that the people that are really successful aren't afraid of the phone. And you think about today, and you've got so many different solutions that you can use, like AI tools or automation solutions. And actually, and I wrote a post on LinkedIn today about this, is like it doesn't really matter what you've got. Like people who win are the ones that speak to people that are comfortable having a conversation, pick up the phone, and like these AI tools, whatever it is that you're using, are fantastic to help you do things more efficiently. But I would not trade those phone calls and meetings and in-person relationships that you build at conferences for a personalized, in quotes, outbound email from ChatGPT for the world. And I think like that's something that has definitely stayed with me. The other thing I'd say, like over the last 6 years, I've been working at a company called Procore prior to Prefactor, and very different type of environment. Like we were selling into construction tech professionals, people that had used our main competitors, Oracle, Aconex, for many years. And the approach that you take with them is very different. Like you can just pick up the phone to them and have conversations, but these are busy people. These are people that are working 60-hour weeks and working on Saturdays and, under immense amount of stress, whether it's the commercials, whether it's building something, like whatever it is. The way you build relationships with them is a very different approach. And I learned a lot actually during that time. And it wasn't so much, I mean, it was as much about picking up the phone, but it's like, how do you navigate those very complex, kind of slightly old worldy type environments in a more strategic way to build relationships and to ensure that when you haven't necessarily got a product that is ticking all the boxes, that you can maintain those relationships so that at the point that they're going to renew or they're going to upsell or they're going to grow, that they can do that. And yeah, I've got some fun stories from that time as well.
Before we go to the next step of your career, do you have some advice how people who struggle, who have this barrier of just picking a phone and having a call with a prospect, how to improve the comfortability on speaking with potential clients?
I had this question in the cohort. So when I was at Andler, who backed us, a lot of the founders that that were in the cohort hadn't done this before. They might have come from consulting backgrounds or whatever. And I often got asked this question. I mean, you have to ultimately, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. But I think the other part of it is there is a bit of a perception. And I grew up in Middle England. I'm in Australia now, and our cultures are very different to say the US, where there's a bit more of a kind of outgoing. People have trained very early in their life to talk themselves up, which certainly isn't the case in Australia, and it certainly isn't the case in the UK. And I think that the thing that kind of gets you through is don't treat the sales calls that you're doing like a sales call. Treat them like you're just interested about their business. And you're going to be where you should be. If you're an entrepreneur and you're selling something that you're passionate about and you're willing to dedicate many years of your life to, then you really should be thinking about it from the perspective of, well, I care about what this person is doing. And then it's really just a case of like in your mind compartmentalizing what you're trying to do. So, when I reach out to people today, whether I'm selling or whether I'm just trying to validate what we're doing, all I'm trying to do is ask 15 minutes of someone's time to talk about my business. Actually, I don't even want to talk about the business. I want to understand how they are experiencing the problem we're trying to solve. I want to understand, what are the things that are most important to them. And being really naturally curious, like I loved hearing and talking and asking these questions. Not being technical makes some of the conversations a little bit harder. But I think the advice I'd give to anybody is you're passionate about your business is something that you really, really care about. And so as a result, you really should be relatively comfortable being able to just ask questions. I think, when I was at the beginning of my career, I mentioned having a list of questions that you're going to ask definitely helps. It kind of reduces that level of anxiety before you're about to get on the phone. I wouldn't overdo it, and I would definitely let the questions come naturally rather than forcing them. Because if you force them, then it's going to feel like you're forcing it. And I think people kind of pick up on that naturally. But I think like really, you should start with the people that your network, ask them about the challenges that they're facing with the product or the service that you're selling. And then try and work from there, try and pick up on the cues of what is it that they're saying to the questions that you're asking. One thing that you always get taught in sales school is open questioning is really important. And it's the really basic stuff, but the people that I've seen that are the very best people at discovery, and those first calls are always about discovery. You should never, ever go in and try and sell something off the bat. If they ask, you might want to answer, but fundamentally, every single call should be about uncovering until you get to that point. And then really, people don't mind having that conversation. And I think you do one and it'll be a bit awkward, and then you do another one and it's a bit less awkward, and you do another one. And then by the time you know it, you've been doing it for, days and days or hours and hours, and everything's okay. But until you do it, you just don't know, and you just have to do it.
Great advice. When you explained the story about talking for 2 hours with one person who you couldn't even help, so it's probably also important to figure out pretty quickly if you are relevant, if they are relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to kind of definitely filter out people that are not necessarily a good fit customer or a good fit. I mean, like what I've done in the Anna program, it's about 3 months long. I only had about 6 weeks between when I first kind of started working with my co-founder to getting the investment. And we spoke to 100 companies within that time. So, as you can imagine, that was very intensive. I think like every single phone call we had, whether we knew them or we didn't, I treated it like a sales call. And ultimately, what I was doing by the end of that phone call was deciding if they were appropriate for what I was about to say next. In my head, we had a 2 or 3 stage process. First call was discovery. Second call was going a deep dive into like the detail of what we're doing. So more us for talking than them. There's still a lot of them. And then the third call would be when we would try and convert them into a letter of intent or a design partner. And that's the same now. I still treat that same logic. When you're an early stage startup like us, like really what I want to do is learn from as many different people as possible. And so at the moment, like what we have we have a lot of assumptions that we're working on, as many startups too. You're looking at assumptions around your ICP. You're looking at assumptions around the right channels you're going to apply, the right product that you're going to sell, the right direction for the strategy. And so I always think that even if someone isn't particularly appropriate, so as an example, over the last week, I've spoken to 4 different companies, very different types of company from all over the world. 2 of them were appropriate, 1 of them wasn't. The one that wasn't, just because he was irrelevant for what we're trying to sell today, you never know. And this is my attitude, like you never know when someone's going to come back around again. And so I always like really make the time to ensure that call feels as much like they're getting something out of it as you are. Sometimes that's not possible, but ultimately you want people to be going away from that phone call, that message, or that communication with yeah, that was worth my time. Sometimes it's not, but you can't be 100% all the time. But I'd say that's probably the best way to manage it.
So you also try to give value to the prospect. How do you do that?
I think like the art form is understanding kind of what their problem is. So like when you're doing the discovery call, irrespective of whether you're a very experienced construction manager or whether you're a 23-year-old CTO building your AI startup out of Singapore, like ultimately what I'm trying to achieve on that discovery call is understanding kind of what are their pain points today, what are their things that they're keeping them up at night. I guess what I can do is I can share feedback or experiences that I've had, or maybe it's a relationship that I can introduce them to. So, like the other day, this person in Singapore is a great example. He's building an AI company. He wants to work with Procore because they're building something that's in the technology space. And I was like, well, you're definitely not appropriate for us, what you're looking to achieve. But I can put you in touch with someone I used to work with, and maybe there's a relationship there that you can build. And, what I want him to come away from that conversation going is, oh, yeah, well, like, we're not right for them today, but maybe in the future when I'm looking to make a change in my product, that's appropriate. And maybe we'll reach out to them. But then also, every call you want to come off, I say this to myself, I don't do it as effectively as I could, is you want to get a referral. Ultimately, you want someone to introduce you to somebody else. And so you need to provide credibility and ensure that they feel like that relationship has been worth building. And so ultimately, with this guy the other day, I provided him an introduction to somebody that I knew, and I would look to get that reciprocated. I think as well, what I found, particularly selling into CTOs at technology, B2B SaaS companies, there's a lot of goodwill in the market from people like these people who want other people to be successful. And I think that the worst thing you can do is just not ask and not reach out. And so giving value to people, you're not always going to be able to do that. You should always try and do it in some way. You can't just have a one-way conversation. But actually, some people look at this as a way to give back to the community as well. So there's a mutual kind of benefit there implicitly.
I like this change of mindset. If you see the sales calls not as you want to have something from them or you want to sell something, but instead you want to provide value. And even if you sell, if your product is valuable, you are giving them some value, and suddenly you realize you are actually helping when you're calling.
100%. And I think like if you go in fearful of being a salesperson or you think sales is a dirty word, then you're naturally going to be more reserved and actually going to kind of downsell what you're doing and think, well, why would anyone want to talk to me? Like, why does anyone want to pick up the phone? And I think that, like, if you believe in what you're doing, which all of us in the startup world should be, otherwise, what's the point? You have to believe that what you're delivering them is going to provide them with a genuine value add. It's not just been written in a back room of some ROI calculator, which we all know not a lot of them aren't exactly the way they say. But that should give you the confidence going into these phone calls that, yes, you want to give them value, but the biggest value you can provide them is giving them back those hours in their day or enabling them to sell more product or increasing the amount of money that they get from their customers. And I think that if someone's going to the trouble of actually agreeing to speak to you, then there's an acknowledgement of that mutual benefit on the phone.
At the moment, you, as I understand, don't stop the calls if the person doesn't seem to be relevant because it's just 15 minutes. And after that, you decide whether it makes sense to have a second call. But in the past, you probably also had situations or where like your role required maybe also to stop the calls if the person was not relevant, or was it always like that?
No, never.
No?
Maybe I'm just not a very good salesperson, but no, I think when I ask for 15 minutes, and this is a trick, giving away all my secrets, like when I reach out to people, I will always ask for 15 minutes because it's a small amount of time people can give it up. The art is giving them the Calendly invite, which is for 30 minutes, and then them setting the time for 30 minutes and then adding 30 minutes. I don't know. I think you can get quite fixated, and I definitely do in these phone calls where you've got that 30 minutes and you want to fill the time. I mean, like I've always come away from phone calls in the past. You're like, well, I haven't finished. I haven't done that full 30 minutes. Like, I don't want it to feel like a failure if I don't get to the end of the call. I don't think that you should approach it like that. Good salespeople will go in with every call with an intent in mind. So, like I always used to say to my team, what did you achieve from that call? What are you hoping to achieve from that meeting when you go in? And so I think it's really important to have kind of set objectives that you're looking to achieve and being able to determine in your head what's good, bad, what's ugly, what's great. And, you're not the meetings and calls, because we're all people, like they're not always going to go in the direction that you want them to go in. You can set yourself objectives around, well, I want to get a follow-up meeting, or I want to get an introduction into someone that they know, or I need to get them to say yes to a dinner, or whatever it is that you've got in mind that you can achieve that. And then if you're making an ask at the end of the phone call, know that the call's got to have gone well up to that point. Not everybody can justify 2-hour meetings. I know if you're an SDR in a startup and you're just churning through calls and you've got to do 150 dials a week, like it's not possible. I also think that, if someone's willing to spend an hour of their time with you on the phone, then you've probably built quite a good relationship. And, as a salesperson, your role is to generate income. If you've gone off a complete tangent and you're talking about what happened on the Kardashians last night, then yeah, like you probably should rethink your career. But like if you're really talking about the space and the industry and you're learning from them, I think the beauty of being in startups is that, feasibly anybody could offer you something, even if they're not going to buy your product. So, we're talking to CTOs a lot of our time. That's the kind of the people that are buying our product. And even if they don't have a need for it today, they might move somewhere else and they will need it in the future. But two, they could potentially be an angel investor. They could potentially be an advisor. They could potentially be somebody that you invite to your next meetup or your next event, even if they're not going to buy. Or maybe you misunderstood their intent on the phone and they're just being a bit guarded because they've spoken to lots of salespeople, or they're having a bad day. And I think your responsibility when you get on the phone with someone is to ensure that they feel like they're getting something out of it. You're not just taking, and that maybe they just need an opportunity to talk about their problems. And if you can't solve them, being open and upfront about that, because most people just respect that. I think it's when, you get into situations where you overpromise and underdeliver. And I think it's particularly hard when you're working in an environment where maybe you don't have product market fit, maybe you're a startup, maybe you're a scale up, whatever it is, maybe you're tackling a new market or tackling a new segment. And, like joining Procore back in 2018, we were new to the market. We'd entered the market like 18 months beforehand. And I was the first enterprise CSM in APAC. And so I was being asked to manage big customers when I had no experience of construction, no experience of construction tech. I'd lived in Australia for 2 months and we had a product that didn't really meet the expectations of the market. And I remember my very first meeting, and a good friend of mine, a former client, good friend of mine now, Elaine, was at a company in Sydney. It was my first meeting on site, and I went there with my manager, Corey. And I remember entering the offices, sitting down, and essentially being shouted at for about half of an hour because our product didn't do what they needed it to do. Australia's very highly compliant, safety conscious. Our product didn't really have any of that stuff. But I think what was really interesting, and Corey did very well, was like managed to turn that around, and so did I. The next meeting we had, I was just very open and upfront with what we were going to do, what we weren't going to do, and committed to basically telling them straight. It's really important that ultimately when you're taking the time out of these people's calendars, that you're able to add value. And I think always just be thinking how you can add value, whether it's a new way that you can use your product. Maybe it's an introduction to someone that you might know. Maybe it's referencing a case study that you've used previously. And I think that is absolutely the best way to kind of build those relationships and ensure that, you can continue to have those phone calls into the future.
I'm curious, how do you make those calls happen? What happens before? Do you communicate, and do your prospects make an appointment with you? And which advice can you give?
I feel like I've got very lucky whilst at Prefactor, but that I've been able to get a lot of meetings off the back of just LinkedIn outreach. So I know there's lots of ways to do this, but ultimately it's about having a very effective message that you send to people in your LinkedIn ICP cohort, and essentially try and be as specific and targeted as you possibly can. I leverage a tool called Lead Growth Machine, which is really good and has lots of enrichment, but there's loads of them out that I've used Duck Soup, I've used. Oh, there's tons of them that I've had to play with. You don't want it to come across like you're just selling to them, and that's not what I'm doing. I really want to understand their perspectives, and I wouldn't be doing any selling. I'd be doing a lot of phone calls. That is really important. I think I've heard from people that have gone, oh, it's really hard to get people on the phone. It's really hard to reach out. I'd always challenge them. Are you really kind of doing everything you possibly could? You need to change the messaging that you're providing. If it doesn't work, you need to try something else. And there's loads of tools out there that can help you with that messaging. There's nothing wrong with going onto ChatGPT and asking, what the best message is to get the best responses. I know that there's other ways of kind of building, and I'm just focusing on LinkedIn today, but like focused like on your network and LinkedIn, building up a credibility, reaching out to people via your other people's comments and building relationships that way. I think, the thing in the hours-based developer tools is that developers don't want to be sold to. So if I started going out and directly saying to them, I'd be just like shot. So like I need to approach them in a way which makes them feel like it's a mutual conversation and not being sold to, that they are adding value to what we're doing, which they are every time. And yeah, if there's a mutual opportunity, then that's great. But, my kind of method is literally using LinkedIn, particular messages, reaching out to them and generating ideally like 10 meetings a week from that, which is essentially 200 LinkedIn connections that we send out. And then from there, I'll add a Calendly invite, which they will then sign up to. Sometimes if I think it's appropriate, I'll just send a message that says, these are some times, rather than sending Calendly. So yeah, I mean, that's probably the best way I've done it. I mean, there's other ways. Obviously, you go to conferences is always really effective, meeting people and doing that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's been my approach so far. I think if I look beyond kind of what I'm doing at Prefactor and I look at what we're doing previously, a big part of what I was doing at Procore and previously to that, PatSnap and The Key was trying to build broader relationships. And so that's a challenge when you're trying to create additional value in these enterprise companies and continue to sell. And, whether you're selling into an enterprise for the first time or continuing to renew them, ultimately you need a broad range of people that have bought into what you're doing. And you've got to build relationships in a way which, again, is providing them with value. Like, why would a regional manager get on the phone to you to talk about why their team should be using your platform? How can you generate maybe a little bit of competition? How can you kind of incentivize them to need you a bit more? I've seen many ways of selling on kind of socials, but I think that the most impactful way, once you get them on the phone, is to talk about their competitors and what everyone else is doing as well. I know I kind of went off on a bit of a tangent there.
If you send a connection request on LinkedIn, do you send a series of messages before you ask for a call, or do you ask immediately?
So the message I send today, very, very simple. It's, we're doing this. So we're building a platform unifying your authentication, authorization, and audit via our domain-specific language. We're validating our idea. Do you have 15 minutes? We can chat. If you've got selecting sales nav, then I think you've got 200 characters. If you've not on that connection request, you have 100. I think I've seen competing evidence. My evidence is that it works quite well to ask for it in a first meeting. I've seen other statistics which imply that you shouldn't ever put a message and you should just send it out. I think it depends on who you're targeting. If you're targeting mid-managers, then it probably doesn't matter if you've not got a message. CTOs typically like to know a bit more. Interestingly, I got a message the other day from someone who was like, I need even more information from your LinkedIn request. And I was like, I've only got so many characters. I can only do so much. But like my automation flow is sending a LinkedIn connection with that little message. I think what happens sometimes is if you're just used to just saying yes to people on LinkedIn, you don't read that message. And so it always needs a follow-up. And so the follow-up I send is something along the lines of, thanks so much for connecting. I really appreciate your time. We're doing this. And just a little bit more detail on like the ask, which is, again, 15 minutes to validate, help us validate, depending on how. I do also highlight that we're only 5 months in and we are looking for people to just give us some feedback, which is what we're doing. Obviously, I'd love to sell it to everybody, but I'm also very happy to just take a phone call and listen. Again, like that happens straight after the connection. If they don't respond, there's another one that goes out a week later. And I believe there might be another one that goes out a week after that. I think the assumption is that a good connection rate is about 30 to 40%. And so if you're not getting at that level, then you need to like tailor something in the messages. You could always do kind of A/B testing on those connections and just change the messaging and the way that it's being kind of communicated. I haven't done that, but I have been more salesy in the approach, and that did not work with my kind of ICP. And I think, again, very much dictates by who you're speaking to. CTOs, not known for their suffering fools, they want to be able to understand exactly the ask very quickly and be able to give an answer here or there. I'm always really surprised actually by CTOs that respond and say, I'm really sorry, I can't do that, I haven't got the time. Not because, this is obviously annoying, but like if someone's going to the trouble of actually responding to you when they can't do anything for you, I'm like, yeah, I really appreciate that because, otherwise they're going to get another automated message a week after. And as soon as they message you back, then the automation stops. That's been pretty effective. I know that there are tools out there, and I've looked at this of like, how do you make the automations even better? So like automations have their first name. Sometimes they have their company. LinkedIn's a bit hard because, people put multiple jobs and that may not be their first job. So, someone might be an advisor, but that's not their full-time job. And so if you send them a LinkedIn message with their company and that's the company at the top of their profile, then they're going to know that you've essentially automated that because you wouldn't be communicating that way. You have to be thoughtful. And I put my messages through Gemini and ChatGPT to kind of get it tailored specifically. And they often tell me, it's like, oh yeah, you should make it more personalized. If I'm doing one connection at a time, I can do that, but not if I'm doing 200 a week. It's just not possible.
So we started with your beginning of your career, and then we dove deeper in all those lessons, and we also discovered your current lessons. And yeah, we would also like to hear your stories. You mentioned in the beginning that you had some nice stories with your current project, but would you like to tell me something about what happened after the first step and before your current project?
After the recruitment space, I went through a bit of a mid-20s career unsure. So I went and worked in Gibraltar for 6 months at an insurance company. Shouldn't have done that. And then worked in a pub, did a bit of politicking, and then landed a job at the Key. So the Key Support Services is a education technology company that was built off the back of a project that was happening in the Department for Education in the United Kingdom. And essentially, I went in as an account manager. And so we were responsible for renewing, upselling, and growing accounts with public sector bodies in England. Our product sold information services to head teachers and governors. A very different experience to selling it to farmer execs. And I think what was interesting is that, like, I actually came in and I was given feedback that I was too salesy for the environment. I think it's interesting because people in education, CTOs, construction people, they don't really want to be sold to, or rather, they're not used to being sold to. If you think about, typical industries, I think in England, and I know there's a bit of this in America, like a lot of schools historically didn't have to make business decisions. And so they wouldn't have really been exposed to, suppliers selling anything other than like, everything would have been covered by their central kind of governing authority. And so the move which happened coincided with my time there was that a lot of schools were being empowered and given money to run their own affairs. And so ultimately they were going from being head teachers that were basically teachers running kind of curriculum and, supporting the teachers as best they could to being business people in their own right. And so that was a very interesting kind of like experience of learning kind of the best way to communicate with head teachers who are on the one hand all trying to do their best for their students, but on the other hand learning an entirely new career overnight in many cases, and then being able to kind of ensure that we continue to be the trusted voice for essentially advice. We were providing kind of an advice service to head teachers. It was an interesting one because I have great affinity with local government because there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of like reduction in spending that have occurred over the last 15 years. And so I think my natural proclivities for some of their politics probably made it a little bit easier. But I think what really helped was, again, like you have to really empathize with the challenges that they're doing. And the Key were always very good at, as I say, empathizing and kind of being on the side of the school. And I think that definitely helped because when you've got a brand behind you that is known in the industry as being kind of the brand that is trusted and we're a profit-making business, but we're not going to rip you off. Clear pricing, very transparent, really does help. I'd say like one of the challenges we did face was about a year and a half into my time there, we got a competitor, a low-cost competitor. At the time, we spent an awfully long time checking out their website daily. I remember one time I signed up to their platform and the free trial, asked a question, and stupidly, my Gmail account, which didn't have my full name attached, apparently did have it as my name. So I don't know how it works, but I actually got an email back from this competitor going, "Hello, Matthew from the Key Support Services." And that was a bit embarrassing. So I didn't do that again. But I think that challenged us to think differently because we'd been a monopoly supplier and then we weren't anymore. And so we really had to lean into kind of the premium government backed side of it. And I don't know whether struggling teachers that haven't got much money really care about that stuff. I think, yes, they'd like to want to care about that stuff. But I mean, this is also a time when, there was conservatives were in power in the UK and there was a significant amount of like cost cutting that was occurring. And so, there are all of these kind of macro and micro themes that were flooding into us at the same time. And like when I talk about the school situation, these schools were becoming independent essentially. They were being centrally funded, but ultimately they were gaining the power to make decisions for themselves. And so our customers, who had historically been local government, had no longer held the purse strings. And so we had to go from a time where the head teachers didn't see that cost on their balance sheet to a time when they had to actually see it. And so we were really having to justify the ROI. The fact that we managed to do that was down to the product, but it was also down to the relationships that we had. And a lot of what we had to do was navigate this new world of, well, who are the influencers? Who are the people that were going to lead these new kind of groups of schools where naturally they've kind of disbanded from the local government, but it doesn't make any sense to be on your own when you've got massive purchasing power, and then being able to negotiate discounts. I think the interesting thing about the Key was that I was leading the team for the last 18 months I was there, and we didn't have any on target earnings. So it was an interesting way of like not really being able to incentivize your staff to sell more because the business at the time had decided they weren't going to give bonuses for performance. And if anyone's in sales knows, it's very hard to motivate your team. We didn't have a company credit card. We couldn't take people to lunch. The fact that we did as well as we did was more down to the team and the staff that we had, as opposed to kind of any kind of corporate decision making. And so you have to be very nimble. You have to be very kind of adept at understanding the pain points that these head teachers are doing. And so when going into a school maybe that hadn't bought before, or really what you're trying to do is navigate the changing kind of dynamics of this government school relationship and being able to determine, well, do you have the money to pay for this anymore? Do you still need it? What value do you get out of this that then I can then say down the road when I go and speak to your not competitor school, but school close to you, and they then learn from them. And I think that was a very good example of, the conversations that we had. Teachers, if anyone, like, they're very time poor. And so any conversation they have is very valuable, perhaps more so than any other job or profession I've worked with. Maybe I'm biased. My wife's a teacher. My mom's a teacher. My grandma was a teacher. They are extremely time poor. And so, they don't want to speak to salespeople. Like, they couldn't care less. But what they did value was, being able to bring examples from other schools, other groups of schools, how they've been using the software, examples of where they had made changes and that had resulted in benefits. Like a good example was schools are always looking for more money. And so part of the website was about, how you could generate income from your school property. And some of them, they're really obvious, like I'm going to rent out my school fields, but others would be more specific to, I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but doing innovative things which other people hadn't thought of. And I think you're playing to quite an insecure audience because they're not confident on running the schools like a business, but you're adding value and you're a trusted advisor. And I think that was the first time in my career where I thought, this concept of being a trusted advisor is really important to be able to not just get you through the door, but to ensure that you can kind of continue on and build those relationships. And I think within construction as well, a great example actually was, we working with one of the biggest construction companies in Australia, we had sold a product which was not fit for their needs. And as a result, we had a relatively large group of people who were actively against what we were doing. And if we had any chance of renewing this contract, we needed to get some people on side. And there's always that person in an organization who is anti-change. And I think, whether you're selling, whether you're renewing, whatever your role is, you're always about change management. And if you can articulate change management well to people and help them through that journey and not be just the person selling you the product, but the person who is going to help you through that journey, I think is really key to being successful. In this particular example, there was a gentleman called Terry, and Terry hated us. He had been anti our product the entire way through. He was actively trying to undermine us at any opportunity. He had great relationships across the organization with senior members of staff, CEO, etc. Me and my colleague went into this meeting. It was at a hotel down the road at a pub. And I went and met this guy, Terry. And if anyone listening has studied any kind of body language, and someone's sitting like this, crouched up in a corner, they're not a big fan of you. And over the course of the next hour, we managed to coax him out of his shell. And I think what was really key was understanding what was actually driving his level of antipathy towards what we were doing. Okay, this wasn't a direct sales. The end of this was not he would give us $100,000, but the end of the meeting rather was about him going in and advocating on our behalf. We chatted, we talked about the challenges they were facing, why they were so anti what we were doing, what were parts of the product. Ultimately, what it came down to was that this guy was just extremely passionate. He'd been involved in construction for a very long time, and he knew these guys on site, and he cared deeply about what his teammates, the guys on the projects did. And like, they were working long hours. This is very, safety conscious environment, but it is very dangerous. And so like, what he wants to be able to do is ensure that his guys and girls come back safely, that they're not working unnecessary hours to fit their process into our product. But I think also one of the challenges that you face when you're selling overseas, and Procal's an American company and Australia is Australia, is being able to change your messaging depending on the environment and the culture that you're in. And there's always a risk when entering a new market that you approach it and you apply the same kind of playbook that you've applied elsewhere. And so when it comes to America and the way that you approach it there, and you bring it over to Australia, Australians are very proud. They're proud of the country. They're proud of what they do. They're proud of the solutions that have been built in Australia. And if there's a touch, even an inkling of an expectations or arrogance around your approach, then they get their backs up and instantly you're out. And I think that's kind of what happened. This guy felt like he hadn't had been listened to internally. He'd been even afforded the right to talk to us as a vendor. And so us coming along and bending the knee to him, even though he wasn't a decision maker, helped him get over that kind of change management journey, if you like. And I know this all feels very not related to the sales piece, but ultimately off the back of that call, he invited us back for 2 days across a bunch of sites. And for him, what was really important was us hearing the pain points directly from the mouths of his team. And off the back of that, we then built relationships further and further. And of all the relationships I've had in my career with people, customers, it was probably one of the most kind of interesting and impactful, because from the moment we went and sat with him and he was sitting with his kind of crumpled up body language to when I left the business, but he became one of our biggest advocates and was actually promoting us at sites, going to sites and saying, you should use us. I don't know what Terry's doing now, but he was like kind of a born in the wall a member of that business. And that sells as well. And it's not just about putting out those calls. And I think you need to get through those stages to be able to build those relationships. Ultimately, it's all the same stuff.
Wow. That's a very rich career with many valuable lessons. Especially the last one is inspiring, because sometimes you feel like, it doesn't work, or this person is so and so, but in reality they are just basic needs and maybe even misunderstanding. And if you clarify that, then you suddenly maybe can make from a hater to a potential client or evangelist. It's so interesting to listen to your stories and advice. You mentioned in the beginning, like you have some interesting experiences in your current project. Could you tell me a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, sure. So there's so much. I think when we were chatting beforehand, I kind of gave a bit of a sense of like, started Prefactor 6 months ago. I don't come from a marketing background. I come from enterprise sales for the last however many years. Having to make decisions on what you do, from literally the marketing solution you choose to the newsletter tool that you use. And I guess just working out like the right channels, et cetera, et cetera. I think like we've had some great partners during this journey. And I think like it's interesting because when we first started talking to customers, naturally you go to people who are in your extended network. So like I don't really have a big network in Australia, and I certainly don't have a network of CTOs. And so what I was like, well, what's the closest thing to me, which means I can get meetings? And so I went, people in construction tech, people that have built on the Procore platform, let me go and speak to them. Haven't spoken to him before, but at least the first conversation is like, oh, he used to work for Procore, so I can chat to him. I worked with a couple of construction tech companies. It's been great, like, because I think when we first started chatting to them, we were tapping into a need one of the big things is like, how do you sell that product, right? How do you convince somebody that what you're doing is worth their time to continually engage? And these couple of companies, in fact, everyone, during the process, we got 3 design partners and 11 LOIs over the course of this 6 weeks. And as I say, like we didn't have a product. We only released our beta 2 weeks ago. But I think like the challenges that we're focused on are so pertinent. And I think ultimately what we're doing is we're building kind of an infrastructure layer for users. So we're allowing people, engineers, to build the functionality to allow their users to log in, and then their access controls and permissions for their business, really. And this stuff is stuff that most people would go, well, this is a solved problem. And I think that was initially my consideration. And I think when thinking about whether this was worth pursuing, it was, what's the opportunity? What's the space that we're playing in? Is there a sufficient level of kind of technical differentiation that we can apply that's going to make us a success? My co-founder Simon has done a brilliant job of kind of coming up with a very novel way of tying these very different functions together, which allows us to kind of position ourselves in a way which means that we're not just a standard provider and that we can go a lot broader. But that comes with its own challenges. And I think one of the challenges that we face at the moment is like, well, how do you know which channel to focus on? How do you know, outside of the LinkedIn space, how do you generate kind of that traffic to your website? And then I think more importantly is like, well, how do you know what good is and what isn't? And a lot of this stuff is about kind of being consistent over time. And when you're in a startup, like 3 months feels like a lifetime. We've been going for 5 months, like officially 3 to 4 months to try something. There's like time that you don't have. You almost need to do stuff even faster and faster and faster. It's definitely been an interesting one. But I think like everything I've talked about in terms of kind of the approach I've taken to sales, discovery, reaching out and just being open about the things that you know and the things you don't know. I think that's actually a really interesting point because, like, as I say, I don't come from the background. I've got like I wouldn't say I'm semi-technical. I can't code, but I'm pretty across what we're doing and what we have done. And yet I can go into a conversation with someone and talk about very technical things without really being an expert. And part of that is about being vulnerable in those calls and being able to share, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't understand this stuff. And I think, again, like it's one of those things that is genuine. You can't fake it, but it gives you credibility. And I think it gives you the ability to build those relationships, which is what we're doing. But it kind of gives us an awful lot of joy to be able to kind of build on that. And, hopefully we'll get a pre-seed round in the middle of the year and go on to better and better things. And yeah, there's fun times ahead.
I really like this last advice of being genuine. I think even if you're starting out with sales and you are maybe feeling not very comfortable, maybe it's also even a good idea to mention that and to say if you are uncomfortable in certain topics, you are not very deep knowledge, you can mention that because we are all humans. No one is perfect, and it makes you even more human, I think.
Absolutely. Like without a shadow of a doubt. And I think like it also allows you to kind of level the playing field a bit, and it becomes a conversation with someone that you like as opposed to a conversation with a salesperson. And I think that is key. People don't want to be sold to, they want to be partnered with, and you partner with someone that you trust, and you build trust by being honest and sharing kind of when you feel uncertain. And I think that's really important.
Matt, it was so much fun and is also very valuable to learn so much about sales. Is there anything else you would our audience like to do?
Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to reach out and have a chat about sales in startup land, or just shoot the stuff about kind of how to get off the ground, like, would love to do that. And, we can always work out time zones. And yeah, if anybody looking for a solution to things around authentication or authorization, or you just want to talk about kind of where we're going, and, would love to get in touch as well. Yeah, prefactor.tech. We're super early, validating kind of all of our assumptions at the moment. And yeah, would love to chat to anybody that wants to speak about either of those things.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Matt. Have a nice rest of the day.